most of you have been to one of these things before, and I want to give all the credit to Kelly Hancock. She plans these things and coordinates with the speakers and coordinates with the catalog, the calendar, and she normally gets the privilege of introducing the speaker. But I said to Kelly, I want to introduce Clay for a couple of reasons. He and I have got something in common. My father, who's at 96, still kicking hard, went to VMI, graduated in 1940. Is a history buff, particularly a Civil War history buff. And he had a son under the influence of Dad. I went to VMI 30 years later, and I became a Civil War history buff. Now, Clay's dad, Jack Mountcastle, was and is a history buff. He went to VMI, class of 65. And so he has a son, and kind of under the influence of Dad, he decides to go to VMI and becomes a history buff too, and quite a distinguished historian in his own right. I met Clay a couple of times, but I met him particularly when his book came out in 2009. And I've got his biography here, so I'll have to. Dr. Clay Mountcastle is a retired Army Lieutenant Colonel, now serving as an assistant professor of military history in the U.S. Army Command and General Staff College. When did you finally step down from active service?
In February this year.
And we're so delighted, I personally in this institution am so delighted that he's out of the Army and he's back here where we can use him. Holds a PhD in history from Duke. His other teaching assignments include positions at the U.S. Military Academy, that's otherwise known as the VMI of the North.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
And in the U.S. Army Combat Studies Institute at Fort Leavenworth. But his book came out in 2009, published by the Kansas University Press. And I read the book as soon as it came out, and Clay said, would you mind writing something for me that the University of Kansas Press can put on their website? And I went to it yesterday to see if it was still there, and this is what I wrote 6 years ago. Most historians merely lay out facts in chronological order, relying on good research. Clay Mountcastle goes several steps further. He repeatedly states his central premise that Confederate guerrilla activity was the proximate cause of the development of Union hard war policy. He supports that premise with solid archival research and adds great historiographical research to point out that previous historians have not taken their analysis far enough to connect the two dots. This book is military analysis at its best. Now, it was interesting, when I wrote that, I was also thinking, in 2007, it was Robert E. Lee's 200th birthday, and we were trying to figure out who could give a talk at our annual Roll of Bottomer lecture. It would be a bit different about Robert E. Lee, and we got Brian Holden Reed to come from England to give the British perspective of Robert E. Lee. And he gave a fabulous historiography of how the British view of Lee has changed through time. And one of the other great traditions in England is many of the finest English historians have been active duty Army officers. And when over the period of time those active duty Army officers look back at history, they're also making it relate to history as I see it today. So British colonel or general writing right before World War I would say something, and right after World War I, a different man would say something different. But they made it relevant to the military situation that they see today. And I think that one of the great contributions of Clay's research in his talk today will be, you will say to yourself, doggone, we're watching some of this happen in the newspapers today, not just in the history books. So with no further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. Colonel Clay Mountcastle.
Thanks, Wade. Thank you. Thank you very much. All Well, thank you very much for having me here. This was a great opportunity for me to get away from the cubicle a little bit. They have me wedged into down there at Fort Lee. Now, the guys I work with up at the Command and General Staff College there at Fort Lee, when I told them I was going to get the chance to come down here, none of them, oh, Mountcastle, nobody's going to listen to you. So don't feel bad. Don't have your feelings hurt when you're sitting in a room talking to yourself during the lunch hour. So again, thank you all for taking your lunch hour and coming down and spending some time with this. What I'd like to do is just basically tell you the story kind of behind the story behind the book. Because it was like a lot of research and writing occurs, it wasn't necessarily planned out, and it didn't necessarily happen according to a set plan. It just kind of happened. And so I thought I might share with you a little bit about how I came about, settled on this topic, wrote about this topic, and some of my thoughts on the topic since the book has come out. But it really, the story behind it all starts when I was a new graduate school student attending Duke, and I knew that I had to start researching and writing about something. I was still an active duty Army officer, so I was enjoying my break, being able to hang out on a college campus and not have to wear a uniform every day. That was nice. But my academic advisor said, by the way, you have to do something while you're here too. You have to contribute to scholarship, so you got to go find a topic and you have to get busy with that. So I dove into. I knew that the Civil War was going to be it for me, although I was interested in a lot of different things. It was, as Waite mentioned, with being the second in the line of VMI guys, surrounded by the Civil War for 4 years while you're there at VMI. And having been taken to a number of different Civil War battlefields throughout my growing up years, there was always another reason to go to Gettysburg. Well, you haven't seen it in the snow, son. You got to see it in the snow. All right, well, no, we're just there. Wait, no, there's a new monument that was just polished last week. You got to go back and see now that it's polished. So the Civil War had been great. That's when I first learned about psychological warfare. Wait, was just the whole, the Civil War stuff, the VMI stuff, just that's right, very finesse, not the hard hand. But I knew it was going to be Civil War, but I had no idea what. And I thought that there was something that I was interested in because a couple years prior, I had visited the site of Andersonville Prison down in Americus, Georgia, outside of Americus, Georgia, Civil War prison camp. And for the first time in my life, I'd actually been truly interested in something that I wanted to research more on my own. Heaven forbid, go to the library and get a book on your own without being told to do it. So I started to look into Civil War prisons and found them very interesting. And I was interested in all the prisons around here in the Richmond area. I was interested in the conditions within those prisons. You hear the terrible stories about starvation and disease and everything that the prisoners in both prisons in the South and the North had to endure. So I thought that maybe there was something there that I would get into. So armed only with that, I traveled to the U.S. Army's Military History Institute, MHI, at Carlisle Barracks in Pennsylvania, and the very helpful staff there set me up at a table, and I said, this is it. I'm starting my contribution to scholarship right here today. And again, armed only with this idea about something about prisons. But I think that's how a lot of scholarship starts. You really don't know exactly where you're going, you just start rummaging around in the woods. And the staff brought out they do a great job there. They bring out a cart loaded full of boxes, full of manuscripts, diary entries, letters written by Civil War soldiers. And so they parked it right next to me and said, let us know if you need anything, have at it. So I started to just randomly pull things out and look at it and do my best to try and read the 19th century scribble and writing. And if you've ever done that before, that can be a challenge too. But it was immensely, entertaining, enjoyable to sit down and really start reading some of these letters and hear what these soldiers are saying. And I'm trying to talk about prisoners of war. I'm trying to find, maybe I can find a letter from a soldier that was stuck in a prison camp somewhere, and I can really get going. I wasn't finding too much of that. I had been handed a cart that was loaded with manuscripts from soldiers that were served in regiments from Illinois, Indiana, Iowa, serving in the Trans-Mississippi region. And I wasn't hearing a lot about prison camps. I wasn't hearing a lot about soldiers. But within an hour or two, it dawned on me that I had at least encountered 3, 4, maybe more times these mention of these things called bushwhackers or guerrillas or something, and that just kind of stuck out to me. So I started to, as I was looking for prisons, every time I saw mention of this guerrilla, bushwhacker, partisan, something like that, I would kind of set it aside. And after 2 days of picking through things there at MHI, my stack on prison camps notes was about that big, but my stack on this mention of guerrillas and partisans and all that was, pretty high. So I said, well, that's really interesting. There's something there. And the reason I found it so interesting was I had never really heard or considered a notion of something other happening during the Civil War than what we read about in the textbooks, the Battle of Gettysburg, Battle of Antietam, these conventional scale fights on large battlefields that we all know. Every time I had visited a battlefield before that, I had never seen a marker talking about guerrillas or bushwhackers or anything like that. So I said, here's an area that, I could possibly delve into. But I really had no idea what I was going to do with it. All right. So then you start the second and third order stages of your research. So I started going to the library and seeing what other people had already written about this. And I came to find out that the answer to that was not much. Right? There weren't very many books at all devoted to the issue of guerrilla warfare during the American Civil War. Now, there were biographies dedicated to partisans and some of the partisan captains and all that. I'll talk about those in a minute. But there weren't a lot of studies talking about the subject in general analysis, or any level of that. So I didn't have much to go on. I just knew that it was an interesting topic and I wanted to do something with it. So I had to figure out a way to try and really get into this. And so what I started to do was I started to try and figure out who these people were, these partisans, these bushwhackers that I heard so much about. And in an attempt to do that, it became perhaps even more vexing because you just learned that all these different characters, guys like Champ Ferguson, pictured there on the left, or John Singleton Mosby, the famous Gray Ghost. You notice his portrait there in the middle on the wall, right there, one of his famous portraits of Mosby, or guys like William Clark Quantrill on the far right. These are all noted guerrilla commanders, leaders that did, things depending on who. If they were writing from the Southern perspective, they were brave, gallant, defenders of the cause. If you were reading from the Northern perspective, they were criminals, murderers, what have you. So the personalities were there, but there was very little linking any of them to either the Confederate government themselves or linking themselves to one another. And it became, again, much more of a challenge to try and figure out who exactly was doing this. What I couldn't do is find a very easy explanation of who the guerrillas were and who these bushwhackers were, because you come to find out they're all different types. There were people that would desert from the Confederate military and then take up, their rifle and shoot it at the Union soldiers when they marched by their home. There were people that had remained in the home front that would do the same thing. There was just randomized violent resistance to the Union occupation in the South that resulted in guerrilla warfare. And then you had these characters like your Mosbys, like Ferguson, and like many, many others that did it under the guise of organized partisan units conducting what they considered irregular warfare against the Union occupiers. Right? So there are so many different definitions and characteristics and all this of these people that I quickly found out that I was going to have a very hard time if I wanted to try and produce something that made sense of it all, to say, hey, this is who everybody was conducting guerrilla warfare. It was almost a bridge too far. It was something that I couldn't really comprehend how to do. So then I asked myself, well, what am I going to do now? So then I just started to focus on what were these guys doing. Okay, don't worry about the people so much, but get an idea about what they were doing. And what they were doing was, wreaking havoc for the most part. In some cases, it was very minute, very mundane stuff, tearing up a railroad track. In places like northern Missouri and in Tennessee, those railroad tracks were extremely important to the Union Army. The further they got into the occupied South, the more they relied upon the railroad. Their extended communication and supply lines. Right? So sometimes it only involved sabotaging a railroad track. Sometimes it was as simple as going out there and cutting the telegraph line. Okay? Other times it was attacking Union pickets. that had wandered too far from camp. Right? Other times it was more substantial, coordinated attacks on Union wagon trains, like the famous Berryville wagon raid in Northern Virginia. Right? So again, it's a bunch of different things, but all of them, having a particular type of impact, whether it was, large scale or small. So you start to see, maybe not the thing to do is focus on who these people were, but focus on what they were doing and what the activities were. And then you had, even more significant, what many people would refer to as massacres out in the Missouri-Kansas area, like the sacking of Lawrence, Kansas by Quantrill's raiders in 1863. So that was fine. I had a feel for who these guys were to a certain extent and what they were doing. But as I sat and tried to figure out what would my take on this be, what would my argument be, I couldn't come up with much. Until one day, a professor that knew nothing about the Civil War, knew nothing about any of this that I was talking about, was chatting me up in the hallway, and I was trying to explain to him, I had kind of hit a brick wall. I didn't know what to do with this, and he simply asked me a very simple question I had not yet considered. He's like, "Well, you're talking about all this terrible stuff that the Union Army or the Confederate guerrillas had done to the Union Army. What did the Union Army have to say about it? What did the Union Army do about it?" And I kind of gave him a blank stare. I said, "Well, yeah." But at that very moment, I knew that I had to try and answer that question. And from then on, my focus was going to be on the Union Army's response to all of this. All of the guerrilla attacks, all of the hit and run tactics, all of the attacks on the train system. I wanted to focus on what the Union Army's response to it was. And so I decided to start to frame the issue in terms of a problem, the guerrilla problem, that the Union Army then had to turn around and face. And once I was armed with that, idea, that question, my research became a lot more focused, and it became a lot easier for me to conceptualize what I was going to end up writing about. Okay, because I had a solid question to ask. Okay, what did the Union Army do in response to this, and how significant was that? And so, again, when you start to do that, you start to turn, and again, it became a matter of faces, individuals at first, identifying Union commanders, Union soldiers that talked about this issue, this guerrilla problem. And again, that's where this whole process had started for me. And it wasn't that hard. I found it was exceedingly not difficult to find Union commanders and soldiers go on record in their letters and their writings home and diaries to express their frustration, their anger, discuss the problem, at length at times. And so the more I could find, it was just, helped me build this whole idea in my head as to trying to explain what the Union Army's response to the guerrilla problem was. And that's what they really did. They framed it as a problem. For them, it was a problem that presented itself at the lowest levels, at the small tactical level, when you're dealing with trying to keep your pickets from getting shot at. It took on a life of its own when you start talking about how it affected Union operations within a certain theater, when the railroad system would go down or when they couldn't get enough supplies to their troops out on the front. It affected their operational decision-making. But what I really became fascinated with was the way that it changed their thoughts on policy towards the Southern people. Okay? And that's what, to me, seemed to be the most interesting, the most worthy of discussing, was just how these guerrilla actions and these activities were starting to change the way that Union commanders and Union soldiers viewed the Southern people. Okay? When the war began, many Union commanders and many soldiers and folks in the Northern press expressed the intent to try and keep it very much a war between the Northern government and the Southern government, Northern Army and the Southern Army. Okay, let's leave the people on the sidelines. This idea of an approach of conciliation. Perhaps if we wage the war carefully, we can win back a lot of Southern hearts and reunite the nation that much quicker. Okay, folks like George B. McClellan were big advocates of this idea of conciliation. Right? What I started to see and started to write about and argue was that this whole notion of conciliation was rapidly eroded as soon as this guerrilla problem started to present itself. and it started to present itself right away in places like Missouri and the Trans-Mississippi. Union commanders marched into those areas in 1861 and 1862, expecting to be able to wage this war on the battlefield primarily, and they expecting to, conduct their operations, as they pretty much wanted to without being harassed by the Southern population. But they found that wasn't the case. Almost anywhere that the Union Army went, they were harassed. They were not greeted as liberators by hardly anybody, unless you're in some, pockets of eastern Tennessee, western North Carolina, where there was some good loyalist sentiment, and some of the Union soldiers were greeted with open arms. For the most part, that wasn't the case. Mostly they were seen as invaders, as occupiers, and not surprisingly, they were met with violent resistance. They were shot at. Their steamers going up and down the Mississippi were fired upon. And so you start to see them explaining this and writing. And this, I knew pretty early on that this examination, this book, was going to have to be somewhat of a psychological study. And that's kind of hard to do. That's scary to do when you're trying to prove how people thought. All you have to go on are their words and what they wrote down. And you have to put a certain amount of trust and faith into what they wrote at the time. When William T. Sherman is talking about, wanting to burn the town of Randolph, Tennessee, because he's so fed up with the guerrillas, shooting at his ships going up and down the river, you have to believe him that, he's thoroughly, his ideas about what's necessary in the war are directly being shaped by this guerrilla problem. And so that's what I really started to focus on, how the perception of the Southern people and what was deemed necessary by the Union Army was being drastically affected by this guerrilla problem. And when I compared it to what had already been written, I also found an area that I could kind of insert my own take on it. And that was, many historians up to that point had seen a little bit of this dynamic going on, but they had somewhat argued that it was isolated, just in a few spots over here. You didn't see a whole lot of this Union reaction or the use of the heavy hand in response to this guerrilla problem. The more I looked, the more examples I found that suggested that this was not, isolated reprisal. This was pretty widespread, and maybe it wasn't happening in the middle of large population centers like a Memphis or like a Nashville or maybe even a Huntsville, Alabama or something like that. But it was happening in small towns. It was happening in small areas along the rivers, along the roads, and it was happening quite frequently where the Union Army would take their aggressions or their frustrations out on the local population. Whether or not that local population was known to be supporting the guerrillas or not. That's the only place they could, get their hands on. When the guerrilla would come and shoot at them at their pickets, kill a couple of their pickets, and then scatter off into the wood line, chasing them was no good. Chasing them wouldn't work for the most part. This, idea of direct anti-guerrilla activity, we're going to go directly confront and capture the guerrillas, that was a pipe dream. Right? They weren't able to do that. So what could they do is they could let the local population know just how frustrated and how angry they were about it, and hopefully the local population will take matters into their own hands and shoo these, bandits or bushwhackers or whatever away. That was the idea. Stop supporting them, hand them over, or convince them to stop committing their depredations against the Union Army. So that's what they started to do. And they started to talk about getting tough with the Southern people, and they started to actually do that. And that's one thing that you have to be very careful about when you're writing and making claims and arguing this stuff, is you don't want to place too much faith into what any particular general or commander said, but you do want to try and show that it wasn't just words, there were also deeds that followed it up. That's where you place your emphasis, and that's where you can, try and add credence to your take on it, is by showing that it wasn't just words, there were actual deeds that were used to back it up. And what I would like to do is read from a couple of examples that I used directly in the book, because I thought that they really showed just how the Union thought process was being shaped by the guerrilla problem, and also what they were doing about it. General Henry Hallux, a scholar in his own right, wrote about the laws of war, laws of land warfare before the war began, and thought pretty highly of himself during the war and throughout, but as far as his intellect. He found himself one of the first advocates of getting tough on not only the guerrillas but the Southern people in response to what was happening in Missouri when he was out there as commander of the district in late 1861. He had this to say during one of his official orders he issued to the district in early 1862. Hallux said this: "I am satisfied that nothing but the severest punishment can prevent the burning of railroad bridges and the great destruction of human life. I shall punish all I can, although I have no doubt there will be a newspaper howl against me as a bloodthirsty monster. These incendiaries have destroyed in the last 10 days $150,000 worth of railroad property, notwithstanding that there are more than 10,000 troops kept guarding the railroads in this state." Okay? When you have to use railroads, you got to guard them, and that takes a lot of soldiers to guard railroads over a lot of open space and time. But these depredations are not usually done by armed and open enemies, but by pretend quiet citizens living on their farms. A bridge or building is set on fire, and the culprit an hour after is quietly plowing or working on his field. The civil courts can give us no assistance, as they are very generally unreliable. There is no alternative but to enforce martial law. Our army here is as in much hostile territory as it was when in Mexico. I have determined to put down these insurgents and bridge burners with a strong hand. It must be done. There is no other remedy. If I am sustained by the government and country, well and good. If not, I will take the consequences. You know, what's significant about what Hallux is saying here isn't so much that, these are bad people and I have to hold the whole local population accountable. The fact that he's saying it in early 1862 is somewhat significant, because up until recently, most historians have argued that, well, the Union didn't abandon this idea of conciliation well until 1863, 1864, when Sherman gets really serious about marching across Georgia and that. I would argue that that happened much earlier during the war, almost immediately once the Union military started to encounter this guerrilla problem. So it had a profound and almost immediate impact. All right? So some might say, well, that's good. Hallux is talking tough, but is he really walking the walk when he makes these threats? And the answer is, for the most part, yes. Okay? It wasn't just tough talk that was happening. We actually saw Union soldiers burning, destroying civilian property throughout the South in response to the guerrilla problem. One case I'm fond of citing is a small town right outside of Huntsville, Alabama, called Paint Rock. I don't know if anyone's ever been to Paint Rock, Alabama. Probably not, because it no longer exists, at least as far as I can tell. This one Union commander reported right after this incident, he said his train was fired upon as it was passing the small town of Paint Rock, Alabama, by what he assumed were bushwhackers or guerrillas. So he said, calling the citizens together, I said to them that this bushwhacking must cease. The federal troops had tolerated it already too long. Hereafter, every time the telegraph wire was cut, we would burn a house. Every time a train was fired upon, we should hang a man. And we would continue to do this until every house was burned and every man hanged between Decatur and Bridgeport. If they wanted to fight, they should enter the army, meet us like honorable men, and not assassin-like fire at us from the woods and run. We propose to hold the citizens responsible for these cowardly assaults, and if they did not drive these bushwhackers from amongst them, we should make them more uncomfortable than they would be in hell. I then set fire to the town, took 3 citizens with me, returned to the train, and proceeded to Huntsville. Right, so, and I think that last line is the catcher. He wasn't just, well, I told them this, and I told them this, and I told them this. And then I went and I set fire to the town, and I carried on my way. Right? He actually did these things. Right? It wasn't just tough talk. And that's the problem, and you've probably noticed this. When you're reading and researching guys like Sherman, some case Grant, but really Sherman, some people can really get intoxicated with his rhetoric, the way his fiery language, the way he talks. Ooh, he's fire and brimstone. That's so interesting and exciting, right? And you can get drawn into people's words and forget about whether or not the deeds were actually carried out. But in this instance, and on many, many others, you know, this hard hand was actually being delivered. Okay? Towns were being burned, people were being evicted. And so I wanted to show that, and that's what, you know, a good portion of the book is dedicated towards, is explaining how this idea of punitive war that the Union Army utilized to respond to the Confederate problem was widespread and very influential in shaping the character and the course of the American Civil War. This picture here is a painting by George Caleb Bingham depicting the execution of General Orders Number 11 out in Missouri. And what General Orders Number 11 decreed or directed was that 4 entire border counties in Missouri were to be completely depopulated and all the civilian property confiscated or destroyed. And this was in response to Quantrill's raid on Lawrence, Kansas a couple months prior. So General Orders Number 11 was carried out in October and November of 1863 in response to that raid. And what I found fascinating was that an order was issued and carried out that basically resulted in over 10,000 Americans being completely depopulated and moved away from their homes, and with most of their homes being burned or destroyed, livestock killed or confiscated. Okay? And I just never heard about that. And unless you grew up in Johnson County, Missouri, or perhaps maybe in the Kansas City area, maybe you heard about it. And you know, the historical societies in the area still refer to it as the burning and all that. But outside of that small little area, you never heard about that. But you know, to me, it was significant. You know, Americans, 10,000 some, being forced out of their homes. And oh, by the way, this was a Union-controlled state. This wasn't the Union Army marching into Alabama and forcing, you know, the Southern sympathizers to get out of there. Missouri was a Union-controlled state. Now, it was very tenuous control, but you know, that adds a certain level of interest to it for me, that these are the types of things happening during the Civil War that we just really didn't hear about. Okay? And it wasn't, you know, just in Missouri and Kansas where the violence was, you know, probably the worst. It was all up and down the Mississippi River, where towns were being burned in response to guerrillas firing at the Union ships. Little towns that you know, people, unless you have ancestors that grew up right around that area, may have heard of, you know. Towns like Donaldsonville, Louisiana, that was shelled by Navy or the Union naval ships that came by once they got fired upon and set fire to by Marines. Right? Up and down the Mississippi. Out here in the Shenandoah Valley, if you've spent time, you know, traveling and listening to historians of the Shenandoah Valley, you know that, you know, times were hard for the people in the Shenandoah Valley, particularly in the fall of 1864 when Sheridan's troops burned a good portion of the lower Shenandoah Valley, and then particularly in Fauquier and Loudoun counties in November and December of 1864, when Sheridan conducted what he called the burning raid across the Blue Ridge into Loudoun and Fauquier counties and destroyed hundreds of farms, confiscated, you know, almost all the livestock, or killed the livestock in the area. And they did this right before wintertime, which, you know, historian Russell Wiley made a key point. That's no small thing to do, to destroy someone's house and take all their livestock right before winter. Okay, it's not dragging them out into the street and shooting them in the head, but it's also quite a punishment for folks for simply supporting what Sheridan felt was an unjustified, you know, brand of warfare carried out by Mosby and other guerrillas in the Shenandoah Valley. All right, so this punitive war happens all throughout the occupied South. Okay, and anytime the Union Army was in an area for more than a day or two, chances were they started to encounter this. All right, so when I wrap things up and when I start to make my conclusions for the book, I try and frame it such that, you know, people trying to understand how this problem and the Union's response really shaped the course and the character of the war, made it the type of war it was by 1864. In my mind, Sherman's march across Georgia and into the Carolinas would not have occurred were it not for this element of the guerrilla problem. Why? Because I feel that Sherman and his soldiers were conditioned throughout their experiences in 1862 and 1863 to view the march across Georgia as something that was not only legitimate but necessary to do. Okay? The idea that the Southern people were the enemy, okay? The idea that we have to take the war to the Southern people's doorstep, as Phil Sheridan said. Okay? They were saying these things because they believed in their hearts that the Southern people were the enemy, and because they supported the guerrillas and what the guerrillas were doing. You know? And every time that they would move into an area, they had to deal with this guerrilla problem. So it really shaped their thoughts on what the war was about and who the enemy was. Right? And that, you know, shaped really what the Union Army was doing to try and win the war by 1864 and 1865. Okay? Now it's a bit of a, you know, a not highly controversial argument to make, that, you know, the guerrilla problem was frustrating and that the Union Army responded with punitive war. But what I think is, you know, and what others have, you know, tended to, and I've had a few water cooler, you know, debates with people about it, was, you know, the extent to which this really shaped the American Civil War. To me, it's plain as, you know, it's very plain. You know, when Sherman or Sheridan and all those others write about these things that they're directing their army to do, they're pointing their fingers at one particular thing, guerrilla warfare. They're not pointing their fingers at Robert E. Lee. If he would have surrendered a year ago, we wouldn't have had to do this. And, you know, Sherman isn't, you know, saying burn the town of Randolph, Tennessee, because they didn't provide, you know, food for my troops. No, these things are being conducted for one particular reason alone. And so when we look back at the American Civil War as this very destructive event that it was, you know, and all the lives that were lost, and, you know, the major operations and battles, obviously those, you know, get most of the attention. But for the most part, most people agree and they concede that it was a very destructive, you know, affair, 4 years. And, you know, a good portion of that destruction, a good portion of that violence that came out of it was due in part to this, you know, aspect of guerrilla warfare. And in my mind, it really shaped and defined the war by 1864. Okay, it kind of created the war that had become by that period. So after the book came out, I was anticipating being savaged by just about everybody and their brother. I disagreed with a few conclusions in my book, as you should do. If you disagree with somebody, you should go ahead and say it, and don't mince words, but I try to do it in a respectful way. And I was, you know, pleasantly surprised that, you know, the savaging did not come. Not yet, I guess. It's been a little while, not yet, but it's out there now, and it'll be out there. But I received some great feedback. One of the best things I received was a phone call from the late historian Michael Feldman, who had written a book called Inside War about the guerrilla environment in Mississippi Missouri and Kansas. Very famous work on the Civil War in Missouri and Kansas. And he found my phone number somehow, and I got a phone call from him, and he was very gracious over the phone. Now, it's interesting. I disagree with a lot of what Michael Feldman had written since about terrorism in American history and all that stuff, but just goes to show that you can strongly disagree with somebody on, you know, scholastic or educational matters, but still, you know, really agree and have a pleasant conversation otherwise about things. But he really liked the work, and I was glad to hear about it. And you know, it's my thoughts on it since have kind of, you know, not necessarily changed, but I often wonder, when you write something, nobody is a better critique of your own work than you are. And I know the holes, you know, in my own study and my own work, and I know they're glaring to me now. And so certain questions still bug me. You know, I attribute a lot of this Union heavy hand and hard war, as you want to call it, punitive war, towards the guerrilla problem, response to the guerrilla problem. I don't know how much of it was due to other things, like soldiers just getting fed up because they've been away from home for 3 years, and so they're just going to go take it out on the local population. I'm sure there's an element of that in there as well. But, you know, obviously when you write a work and you make one argument, you got to stick to that argument. You can't try and make 3 or 4 different ones. And so I know that there's other aspects of this topic that are still lingering, still out there. I don't plan to take them on anytime soon. I have other fish to fry, I hope, and other areas of interest to get carried on to. But A series of other, not a series, but a number of other books on the subject have come out in the 6 years since. A lot of them refocusing again on the more local study, northern Alabama, some areas in Tennessee where historians have chosen to focus on one or two guerrilla groups, tell the story about that local area right there. But what we have seen is kind of an acceptance of this idea now that guerrilla warfare was somewhat of a big deal in the American Civil War. And that's due in no small part, I don't think, to what has been happening with our military over the course of the past 15 years. The frustration, the disappointment, the questioning, what do we do? How do we deal with something like this? The desire to get tough at times with civilian population. Okay, now we have that current example that presents itself as the relevance isn't hard to come by then in that case. So I know that a number of my military friends that have been nice enough to take a look at the book have liked what they saw. They said it helped them with their own thoughts on guerrilla warfare, regular war, and dealing with it and all those things. And so that's a good thing. But it's a topic that I hope that people remain interested in. I hope that when current events change, as they will, and that relevance that's seen today kind of goes away, that people will still remember that the Civil War wasn't just fought on battlefields like Gettysburg and Antietam, that it was fought in, as I say, the spaces and the time in between. So I'll wrap up the formal portion of that and be glad to answer questions if you have any. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I just have two-part question. One is, how much of this guerrilla violence happened after the cessation of the war? And then how do you think it influenced Reconstruction?
It continued on in varied degrees in certain places during the Civil War, and I think it had a direct impact on Reconstruction, a negative impact, obviously, on Reconstruction, particularly in areas like the Deep South and out in Missouri and Kansas. Missouri and Kansas, the violence was there before the war, it happened during, and it continued on after. Jesse James and Cole Younger, they were guerrillas they were Southern supporting guerrillas during the Civil War, and then they go on to kind of be outlaws, afterwards, doing what they do. In places like Arkansas and Alabama, you saw a lot of violent resistance to Reconstruction efforts. Obviously the Ku Klux Klan has its roots in armed violent resistance to Union occupation, and a lot of those that first started out the KKK had conducted that type of warfare during the Civil War. So there's a direct link and a direct influence. Yes, sir.
I have a question.
That happens to me all the time.
Was the guerrilla war, because a lot of things with the start of the Civil War, I read that it was the war up to that point where they had foreign dignitaries from all over the world, even some people from the Crimean War, were amazed at what was transpiring during the Civil War, spies
Sure.
and balloons.
Yeah.
And all that. Was it this American Civil War, the start, if you will, the guerrilla type of tactic?
No.
And,
No.
and the question was, I read also that was Sherman's, one of the primary things to do a punitive blow when he had this so-called March to the Sea was to get at that.
Well, yeah. So I'll try and take that in part. Guerrilla tactics and guerrilla warfare, extends well, before even, Western history. But one of the things I write about in the book, the first chapter, in fact, is devoted to the American experience with guerrilla warfare before the Civil War in places like Mexico or in dealing in the Seminole Wars with Indians. Because these are the tactics that were being used against, the American armies and even the Americans acting as guerrillas and partisans during the Revolution. So the idea, the concept itself wasn't anything new, and the response, wasn't anything original in the Civil War. It's the same response that had been happening in those previous conflicts. And to your other question, the second part about your question was, now I've forgotten.
And I had another one quickly, if I may, I don't want to monopolize it. What was it, one of Sherman's?
Yes.
Was it really?
Yeah, I mean,
The severity of his Marxist, other than just Marxist?
well, he starts talking about, punishing the South, and he uses the term punishment. He starts punishing the people of the South and breaking their will in 1862. And part of his, I would say a significant part of his efforts in conducting a raid through Mississippi in 1863 was to, one, show that he could do it, show that he could march his army into Mississippi, destroy the rail hub at Meridian, and then withdraw all the way out. Because Grant and Sherman were thinking about taking on this idea of raiding strategy. Let's forget occupying and holding ground. Let's just go destroy what we want to destroy and then withdraw. Raiding strategy, and that was kind of the precursor to what he does in Georgia. But a big portion of what he wants to do in Mississippi is let the people of Mississippi know that, hey, you've really screwed up. Okay, you've supported these guerrillas against us. Not only are we going to destroy Meridian, but on the way back from Meridian, he tells his troops, have at it. The towns that are destroyed in northern Mississippi on the return from Meridian had nothing to do with supplying the Confederate Army, provisions, or anything like that. It was simply done to send a message. And that's what Sherman was pretty much all about. Yes, sir.
Over the years and over the wars, I don't remember any of this punitive action against the civilian population doing anything to change the situation. The Civil War,
Right.
World War II,
Right.
Vietnam, and now. Has anybody ever come up with anything that's going to work?
I guess the best answer is probably no. At least in the American experience, the punitive approach has not seemed to get the results desired. Whether it was during the Seminole Indian Wars, and people say, what about the Mexican War? We never hear about that. Well, we weren't in Mexico long enough, thankfully, to really see the full guerrilla problem play out and what we would do in response. So the answer to your question is, particularly in the American experience, this hard-handed, reprisal approach, or punitive war, as I call it, really has never, delivered the type of results that you would want in trying to put down an insurrection or guerrilla warfare. But it's the natural human response to the very frustrating tactical and operational situation that presents itself. It's the low-hanging fruit. Okay, it's you can't get your hands around the perpetrators, but what you can get your hands around are the people sitting on the side of the road, watching it all happen. And so even today, there's the tendency to get tough. You get angry, you want to get tough, but lashing out rarely, results in any type of positive results. I mean, we've got two. Yes, ma'am.
Were the South had home guards?
Yes.
That stayed the house? Were those people involved in in shooting at the Unions?
At times, yes. At times.
So they were also.
Sometimes home guards could have been deserters that decided to come home and send the home guards. They could have been, convalescing or something like that. Or, yes, so the answer is yes. At times, they were part of the guerrilla problem as well. Sir.
First, thank you. I really enjoyed,
Thank you.
listening to you. Second, this is just an observation before I ask a question. Lincoln was supposedly noted for his kindness and his kind of reconciliatory feelings toward the South at the end of the war, but it just kind of points to at least the dual nature of Lincoln.
Sure.
That he could sanction something like this, and then when the war was over, start talking about how we need to come together. I just thought that was kind of, it's ironic.
Yeah, it is. Well, there's, the Civil War steeped in irony. But
And the second, but what I wanted to ask was, how many of these people were actually recognized by the Confederate government? It seems to me I read once that the only guerrillas that were recognized by the Confederate government were Mosby's people.
Mosby and
Quantrill is kind of ostracized.
oh yeah, absolutely. No, in 1862, the Confederate government passes the Partisan Ranger Act, which allows local partisans, rangers, to form partisan ranger units and carry out their work against the occupying Union. That does not work out very well, shown by the repeal of the Partisan Ranger Act in 1864, where the Confederate government is like, this is not, we've got a bunch of guys out here running around attacking, and we don't see any of this benefit the Confederate Army, the Confederate government, so they repeal it, with the exception of Mosby and McNeil. McNeil's Rangers operating in Virginia as well. Those are the only two partisan commands that are mentioned by the Confederate government that are allowed to continue on their partisan, actions. And that's another, great aspect about this topic is it shows that, we'd like to, or we tend to assume sometimes that once the Civil War begins, everything that happens within the scope of the Civil War is being controlled by a Robert E. Lee or an Abraham Lincoln or, a General George Meade or something like that. A portion of what's happening during the Civil War is being controlled by those people. So much is occurring throughout the South that is under no official control of either government, and it's truly a civil war. It's a civil war of, people fighting against each other, neighbor fighting against neighbor at times, and it defies that idea that, well, if something's happening within the South, then obviously Robert E. Lee and Jefferson Davis are somehow in control of it. That's absolutely wasn't the case.
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
In all your research manuscripts, did any of the Union generals ever concede the point that they would do the very same thing if the North had been invaded by the South?
Yes, I can't remember, especially who we were talking about. They were talking about, Chambersburg, Pennsylvania, and they were talking about Lee's invasion of the North, and this was in 1864. Some generals were reflecting on it, and a general had mentioned that he was surprised that the Lee's army had been as gentle, in his words, has been as gentle with Pennsylvania, because he didn't intend to be as gentle with Tennessee. I believe were some of the terms of his words, because he conceded that if the shoe was on the other foot and the Confederates had occupied the North for some point of time, chances are they would have encountered the same type of guerrilla resistance as in the South. Sir.
Realize the South is in a weakened state as the war went on.
Yes.
But was there any specific counter response by Southern forces against Northern civilian centers of population?
Not really. And the only examples we really have are the Army of Northern Virginia's two campaigns into the North in 1862 and then in 1863. And during those, campaigns, we don't see, a lot of punitive action against northern towns or anything. You don't see it to the same extent. And my reason behind that is they weren't there long enough. They kept moving. Had they occupied places like Sharpsburg, Maryland, had they occupied places like Carlisle, Pennsylvania, for any substantial period of time, I anticipate that you would have started to see that. But those two campaigns were relatively short, and you just didn't have a lot of Southern troops occupying northern population centers to see that happen.
Well, for example, like after Sherman's march through Georgia, is anything in the literature that indicates there's an extreme sense of vengeance on the part of the South, or is this something that,
Yes. Yeah.
Things have gone so far that it was just sort of...
Well, for a lot of people, Sherman's actions only, galvanized their commitment to the South. Now, there's not much they could do about it, but Sherman's, that's why you still don't find Sherman Avenue in Atlanta or anything like that, because they're still bitter about it. They're still bitter about it. But I don't know if that's true. I've often heard that it's like a city ordinance that nowhere within the city limits of Atlanta was anything be named Sherman. I don't know if that's true, but I've just heard it.
It's a good story.
It's a good story. It's a great story. So don't mess up with facts. Yeah, exactly. It should be true. But it absolutely embittered people. It didn't have the effect that Sherman wanted it to have in a lot of cases. In some cases, it probably did, but it didn't bring the South to its knees per se. The South was brought to its knees in 1865 simply because it had lost the means to continue the war. Not necessarily the will so much, to a certain degree, but I think it was their capability to conduct the war, the means to conduct the war that was lacking in 1865, perhaps more so than the will. Yes, wait.
Clay, one of the things I really enjoyed about your book was the Confederate guerrillas in the Missouri-Kansas area was so much worse early in the war. And if you look at the Union generals who were in charge of the hard war, they were all there
Yep.
in 62, 63.
Yeah.
Sherman, Sheridan, Hallux, Grant.
Yeah.
Did you see any reaction or development of the Union high command in the Eastern Theater the same way, other than, you know, transferring guys east?
Sure. I think that what I saw in the Eastern Theater was with guys like McClellan, who is so committed to conciliation, even after he gets, you know, thrashed and during the 7 days at Harrison's Landing, is writing that letter to Lincoln talking about, we still have to make this a very careful war. We can't involve slavery or anything like that. You know, with guys like that, you had your, you know, one or two that were so committed to conciliation in the East, and Lincoln not to a point yet where he was willing to really take the gloves off, as it were, that it was left to guys like John Pope in Virginia that had just come out from Missouri. When he gets to Virginia, he starts to decree that, hey, you know, we're going to start shooting people along the train tracks if they start tearing up the rails. So to a smaller extent, you know, and I think, again, the problem was not as intense out here in Virginia until Mosby really gets going in 1863. So I think it was just kind of a delayed reaction, simply because you didn't have the intensity of the problem out here in Virginia that you did out west, you know, in the early years of the war. But like you said, all those guys are out west, the Grants, the Shermans, the Sheridans. It's no coincidence that, you know, they served out west in the early part of the war. All right, so again, I'd like to thank you all for coming here. Let me tell you, I've given a number of talks, and you can tell the quality of the venue by the fact they give you water in a real glass. You know, so I thank you for that. I thank you very much for your time. Thank you for coming.